Hi, my name is Alex Marienthal. I'm a forecaster at the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center, and I'm going to be presenting the third of four talks for the Avalanche Fundamentals course about decision making in the backcountry, what often is referred to as the human factor is a big part of this talk. So the last couple lectures taught you about the snowpack and weather and terrain, the snowpack and weather that creates avalanches, and the terrain where avalanches happen. Now, the fourth variable that we need to have an avalanche accident is humans, ourselves. When we put ourselves into avalanche terrain, we create the avalanche risk. And I assume everyone taking this class is either here because they snowmobile or ski or snowshoe or do some sort of activity, winter activity in the mountains. And you may have seen the statistic before that 92% of avalanche victims trigger the avalanche themselves, or it is triggered by a member of their party. And this is highlighted because it's because we do these activities, it's because we want to go have fun in the mountains that we become avalanche victims if we find ourselves in the wrong spot at the wrong time. Now here's a photo of a snowmobiler high marking on a slope. And the most concerning thing here is that they are doing this above this group of 4 or 5 people parked on the bench, where if the slope did slide, it would bury the whole group and there would be many more people to do a rescue and no one to rescue them potentially if they're all buried. Now, high marking, snowmobiling, skiing on steep slopes is not, there are times you can do this and there's times that you should avoid doing this. And I don't know the exact situation in that last photo, but here's that same slope on a different year, a couple years ago, where the snowpack was really unstable and the snowmobiler triggered this big avalanche on that slope. Luckily, nobody was caught in that slide, but it's highlighting that there are times when the snowpack is stable enough that we can play on steep slopes if we want, and there are times that we need to avoid them. And if we're unsure, or if there are clear signs that the snowpack is unstable, we should play in flat terrain and do our best to stay out of avalanche terrain altogether. And a lot of days throughout the winter are exactly that. They are basically trying to find goals where you have to avoid most avalanche terrain. And if you do find that your route is going to cross avalanche terrain, you need to make a very thoughtful decision whether it's safe to do so or not. And most avalanche accidents either occur because we underestimate the avalanche hazard and then proceed into avalanche terrain, or we overestimate our ability to manage the avalanche hazard. This is an avalanche that killed a snowmobiler outside of Cooke City in 2014. A pair of riders knew there was an avalanche warning, a high danger on all slopes due to 2 or 3 feet of snow falling on a very weak, sugary basal layer. And they intended to avoid all avalanche terrain that day. However, a couple roads outside of Cooke City, which are groomed trails, shown here, Daisy Pass Road, and then Lulu Pass Road is actually up in the upper right corner there, for reference for another story coming up. But they intended to avoid all avalanche terrain, and you can see where the avalanche broke in this red line in the lower right, and the X is where the rider was buried. They were riding up that road, and he just went off the road into what looked like a small meadow through the trees, but had this starting zone above, which I just showed. And this is with the road, the groom trail, and where the debris stopped is where the person is standing there, and off to the right is where the rider pulled off the road and up into the trees. So this group had a situation where they overestimated their ability to manage that high danger, and unfortunately found themselves in avalanche terrain where they didn't expect it. In February of 2017, I was in Cooke City forecasting and had a situation where I overestimated my ability to manage the avalanche danger. I was doing field work there, and we had received over 8 inches of snow water equivalent over the past week, equaled about 5 to 7 feet of snow. And the snowpack down there at the time was actually fairly strong and held up to this load pretty well. We didn't see a lot of activity during this part of the storm, but we knew that at some point the big load was going to push the snowpack to a breaking point and we'd have big avalanches. And so on this day, this storm was going to continue, a heavy snowfall and rain, and we decided to issue an extreme avalanche danger, and felt that this was probably going to be the breaking point of the storm. This graph is showing the snow water equivalent at the nearby Fisher Creek Snowtell site from October through April, and the steepest spike there in the beginning of February that I put the bracket on is where this storm occurred, and shows just how rapidly that increase was. And no snowpack, no matter how strong, was going to hold up to that load. And so the day of that extreme danger, I talked to Doug back at the office, and he said, hey, be careful, maybe don't even go out today. I was like, I'll just go up Lulu Pass Road on the Groom Trail, come back to town, see how hard it's snowing. Continued to snow really hard that day. I went up the road, which goes right through the bottom of this avalanche path. This photo is a picture from July 4th of 2017, so a few months after the storm. But it shows really well all the destruction and how far that debris ran is where all the snow is remaining. And so I went up and down this road about 8 hours before this avalanche happened, having no idea of what I was exposed to, and consider that a close call. And just, it was an extreme danger, something I've never experienced other than that day, and something some people have never been out on, and many people never will. And so something like an extreme danger, you probably should stay home. And for some people, high danger is a good enough reason to stay home, or to really maybe go somewhere where you know for sure you're not going to be close to avalanche terrain. So in many avalanche accidents, it's problems in decision making that create them, whether we know it at the time or not. And good decisions will help us avoid avalanche accidents, and a little bit of good luck, because sometimes a lot of us have gotten away with bad decisions and had good luck. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but when we get lucky, we need to recognize it, that we may have made a bad decision, in order to avoid doing that again in the future. And so ultimately, it's not just a snow problem that leads to avalanches, it's also a human problem. We need to master ourselves just as much as we need to master our knowledge of the snow and weather, and be able to recognize really what is leading us to make decisions to go where we want to go. And part of the problem is that we can easily be fooled. We can get a little too focused on one hazard or one aspect of our lives and walk into another thing. And we need to maintain situational awareness at all times and think about not just what is going on out in the woods while we're out there, or in the mountains, but what's going on in our own personal lives, emotionally, physically, and not just be tunnel visioned into our objectives for the day. So for the bulk of the rest of this talk, I'm going to first talk about human factors, or oftentimes maybe referred to as human errors, things that distract us from the objective data and maybe cause us to make poor decisions. Things like attitude, ego, incorrect assumptions, denial, tunnel vision, complacency, money or time investment, group dynamics, social media, peer pressure. And I don't want to give examples of each one of these, but there's a good starting point of things to keep in mind that often drive our decision making when they shouldn't. Other things that can distract us from the data we should be basing our decisions on are like confirmation bias, which is where we accept the data that supports our initial opinion or what we want it to support. Where if we want to see stable snowpack, we'll find data that says it's stable, and you might brush off the one or two pieces of data that show that it's unstable, when really those are what you should be focusing on. Some other things that fall into this category of human factors are blue skies, nice weather, powder fever, that can kind of give us a false sense that that the snowpack is more stable than it is, but we see a lot of accidents on blue sky days. There's the risk homeostasis from having better gear, from being more prepared to spend the night out, or from having an avalanche beacon or an avalanche airbag pack. Sometimes that can make you feel more protected. So if you're willing to ski a slope just because you have a beacon or an avalanche pack, that's not good enough. Really, if you're going to go into avalanche terrain, you should feel good enough about the stability that you would leave that stuff behind, but never leave it behind because sometimes we're wrong. Poor communication between group members, not speaking up if you see something that a red flag that someone else might see, or if you just have a bad feeling. Really checking on the whole group regularly, seeing if anyone has any reason that we shouldn't continue on the way we're going, or any alternative ideas. This should really be a common conversation for all groups, and asking each other if you're cold, angry, tired, hungry, checking on everyone's emotional and physical status. When you're hungry, when you're tired, cold, or angry, you're probably not going to make as clear of decisions, and it's a good time to dial back the objectives if these sorts of things are popping up. The acronym FACETS is used to describe some common human factors, or mental shortcuts as they're referred to here. And they come from a study of 600 avalanche accidents. The study was done by Ian McCammon, a professor in Utah. And he found that people took more risk when they operated under these mental shortcuts. And the F is familiarity. If you're not reassessing the snowpack today because you saw it yesterday, or you saw it last week, or because you've done it before in the previous seasons, things change quite a bit from year to year, let alone day to day or week to week. Trying to be accepted by your peers or society, or trying to get noticed, causes people to get distracted from the objective data when making decisions. And being committed, really wanting to achieve an objective, something, this is like summit fever, where all season long you might have wanted to get to this summit, and this Saturday is the day you got to go with your buddy George, and you know, halfway up you see some signs of instability, and you've invested a lot of time and mental energy into this, and it's hard to turn around. But the number one plan A of any day should be to come home safely. And you can always try again, even if you've traveled halfway across the world for something. You need to take pride in turning around, because we see many people die that way, being too committed. And I see at the end of that last bullet point, I'd say choose partners wisely. I'll elaborate on this a little bit more, but it is really important that if your goals don't line up with your partners, maybe you go separate ways. And whether it's one way or the other, if you feel like you really want to get to the summit and you're dragging people up there, you might be putting them in situations where they're uncomfortable. Or if your partner is always kind of dragging you up the mountain, and you're not listening to when you're tired or have a bad feeling, it's time to find another partner. So the E in the acronym facets is for the expert halo. Be cautious of being overconfident in your knowledge. Always kind of realize that there's a lot we don't know about the mountains and the snowpack out there. Once you take this class, you'll feel like you know a little bit more, and then you might learn by trial and error that you don't. And I've had that happen over and over again. I've got my level 1 15 years ago, got a master's degree in snow science, and have been forecasting, and I still get surprised sometimes. The T in this acronym is for tracks and scarcity. The desire to get first tracks. You can certainly take on more risk when you're the first one to get to a line, or there's definitely some pressure when there's a storm and everything fills back in. And of course, when it snows, the danger goes up. So we need to give it some time to stabilize. And if you go during the storm, you're going to be in the worst time of stability. But if you wait too long, it might get skied up. So skiing not first tracks is probably the safer way to go. And the S, social proof and facilitation, seeing other people do it, can give us a sense that it's okay to do, but we need to be careful that they might have a different perception of risk, or might not have read the forecast last few days and seen the recent activity or something. So make your own decisions for yourself. And also with social proof and facilitation, be cautious of larger group sizes where it's harder for some people to speak up, and there can be more confusion and communication gets harder. I think more than 3 or 4 people is where you start to see people who we've seen close calls where somebody in the group was like, I had a bad feeling, but never got to say anything. And this goes into the herding instinct, where I mentioned you might see other people doing it, and just because they're doing it doesn't mean it's safe. They might know something you don't know, you might know something they don't know. This photo is my segue into a little section on Saddle Peak, which you've probably heard about a little bit in these talks already, or just from being in Bozeman. And this is where we've seen what we've been talking about, this human factor. There's a lot of them because there's so many humans, for one, but the human factors are just endless out there. And this is an older photo from probably 2010 or 11, when you would see, and you still see this sometimes, but it's less frequent, luckily, just a line of people marching out there on any given powder day. And so don't put your head down and blindly march after the crowd. Kind of pretend they're not there and focus on how much it snowed, what did the forecast say. In these side country areas, as I mentioned, they're the lift accessed backcountry, as I'd like to call it. They have a very prevalent human factor, and in the previous decade, from 2010 to 2019, more than 1 in 10 fatalities in the US occurred after a skier or snowboarder left the resort boundaries. So if you access the backcountry from the ski area, it's just like going to the backcountry anywhere else. I almost think it's more dangerous because a lot of people treat it a little more casually and aren't always prepared, and you need to be prepared with all the same gear, a partner, and your decision-making skills, just like if you were going to Beehive or up into Highlight or something. This is an avalanche that was triggered by a skier in January of 2020 on the south summit of Saddle Peak. And it's a great photo. It's Travis Anderson gave us this photo. It's showing the human factors out there. You see it gets, if we zoom out and see the north summit of Saddle Peak where most people ski off of, it's all tracked up. And so people started getting tracks over here. And this one guy poked out into the bowl and triggered a big avalanche, and luckily wasn't caught and no one else was. And so sometimes we get asked, what about skier compaction? If there's so many people skiing out there all season long, shouldn't that make it more stable and break up all those layers? And the answer, especially out on Saddle Peak, is no, that in the backcountry, there's not enough tracks at the right times, frequently enough to confidently create a stable situation. When you go inside the ski area, they've got 100 times more people skiing over the snow every day and ski patrol throwing explosives at it. And that's what creates a more stable snowpack and breaks up those basal weak layers. On Saddle Peak, we often get hard slabs that protect those basal weak layers. And this is from October of 2009.
Oh yeah. That's it. Serious wind slab. We always got some new snow here, but got like pencil hardness wind slab here, and it's breaking on a layer of facets about, oh, you can just see it there, just junk. It's about 2-3 inches thick, and there's a problem. Here's the ECT, and we pulled that off, and so, this is a weak layer we're worried about. It's just junk under there. And we've got this hard slab sitting on top of it, and what that does is, we can put hundreds of skiers down this slope, and we're never going to impact that weak layer. That weak layer is going to be with us for a really, really long time, and what we got to worry about then is if we put another big load, no matter how much skier compaction we get on here, we could still get a fracture to come right through there on the slope.
So that was filmed in December of 2009, and Carl's showing this common situation we have on Saddle Peak where we get a hard slab that really prevents any skiers from breaking up that weak structure. And then this happened in February of 2010. The Bridger Range received 3 to 5 feet of snow equal to over 3 inches of snow water equivalent over about a 3-day period. And not many people were getting out there during that time. And the first day people got out there, that's what all these tracks you see are off the peak happened on day one. And then the wind was blowing really hard, continued to load up that face. And then on day two of people skiing out there at about 10 a.m., a rider kicked off a big piece of cornice where you can see that gouge coming down the face of the peak, and it broke out this avalanche, which is over 1,000 feet wide. And luckily nobody was caught or harmed. Could have been way worse as you can see all those hundreds of people who skied it the day before. And it's not always big avalanches that kill. In fact, a lot of times deadly avalanches are on the smaller side. In 2018 on Saddle Peak, a solo skier was killed out there after a similarly large storm as the one that triggered that big avalanche, but there was a better snowpack. But the Bridger Range got about 3 feet of snow, heavy snow and strong wind in mid-April. And a solo skier went out to the peak around 10 a.m., skied off and triggered a slide down this chute. Somebody saw it from the lift and told ski patrol, who got out there about an hour later and found the skier with their hand sticking out of the snow, which is unfortunate that they didn't have a partner. We can't say for sure that they wouldn't have died from trauma or something, but having a partner can really increase your chances. If you have a beacon, as well as if your gear's sticking out of the snow, they're going to be there quick enough. The only ones that are going to be there quick enough to make to increase your chances of survival. So that's the crown of that avalanche, just right off the peak. It's maybe 100 feet wide or less. And looking along it, 2 to 3 feet deep. Not nearly as big as that slide that happened in 2010, but plenty big enough to be deadly, especially when it flushes you down over 1,000 feet of terrain. So in order for us to navigate avalanche terrain safely, we need to make an objective assessment of the avalanche danger and adjust our travel plan and terrain use accordingly. I've spoken a lot up to this point about where we make mistakes, these human factors that, as I said, distract us from making an objective assessment. And I highlighted those because we need to recognize them when that's influencing our decision, when we need to ask ourselves, am I going forward to the summit because I invested all my time and money to get here? Or is it truly like a good weather, good snowpack, good group to go continue with? So ways that the objective data that we need to focus on is that Bullseye data that the previous talks about snowpack and weather mentioned. So I won't go into all the details of that, but I'll kind of review it. And you can start by getting the avalanche forecast is where you would find this data. And this includes those red flags of recent avalanche activity or collapsing and cracking of the snowpack. New snow, where it was, how much heavy new snow is a big red flag, a lot of recent new snow. Strong wind, especially after there's been snow, if there's snow to blow around, that's a red flag. Weak layers in the snowpack are a red flag. And then if we have above freezing temperatures for an extended period of time, that's a really bad problem for wet snow avalanches. And as I mentioned, the human factor outlier data we want to be cautious of. Tracks don't mean it's stable, or the fact that we skied it yesterday or last year, or seeing others do it, or any of those facets that we discussed. Truth is another acronym, if you don't have enough already, to help remember some of this Bullseye data. Avalanche, recent avalanche activity, recent loading, terrain, are we in avalanche paths, terrain traps, what's the danger rating, other signs of instability or thaw. And you can get a lot of this information when you start your day from the avalanche forecast. This is just a screenshot from the Gallatin National Forest Avalanche Center's webpage. And the forecast is going to start by telling you how much it snowed and what the wind did overnight or over the last 24 hours. And then down in this snowpack and avalanche discussion, we'll talk about if there's weak layers or what we expect the main avalanche problems to be for the day. And then we also issue this daily danger rating, which is based on this scale, the North American Public Avalanche Danger Scale. And it has likelihood of avalanches and size and distribution that kind of go into the decision of what danger it is. but there's a lot going on there, and there's a lot of overlap and wiggle room. The main thing to focus on is the travel advice, where at low it's generally safe, and at high it's very dangerous, and you need to avoid avalanche terrain. Considerable and moderate are where most avalanche accidents occur, because this is where it's just not as obvious, and where instabilities do exist. And this is where we try to sometimes outsmart the snowpack, where we might think we know where it's okay to go, and then maybe we're wrong. So there's definitely times of moderate and considerable where it's easier to do that, when avalanche problems allow that. If there's no persistent weak layers, that's usually a little more wiggle room in what types of avalanche terrain you can go into. But the key point there is that be extra cautious during moderate and considerable as well. And during high, we certainly see fatalities, but it's often a failure to recognize avalanche terrain rather than trying to do something that maybe you shouldn't be doing. There's avalanche centers all over the Western US, as well as Canada and Europe. You can go to avalanche.org to find those other centers, resources, and forecasts. And if you do travel to other areas, I recommend reading the forecasts weeks or days in advance. As soon as you know you're going somewhere else later in the season, start checking out their weather and snowpack and following along. And that way, when you get there, you'll be way more prepared to figure out where it's safe to go. And it's avalanche.ca if you're going up to Canada. So once you get your baseline information in the morning with the forecast and talking to your group about your plan, once you're out in the field, you want to continue to collect data. Just the whole time you're out there looking for recent activity. Is the wind moving, blowing snow around? Did it actually snow as much as they said in the forecast, or was it more or less? As I said, recent avalanche activity is the best clue that the snowpack is unstable. How that activity appears can kind of give us an idea of what that instability might be. Like in this photo, it's has pretty wide propagation going across rocks and a few terrain features, so it's maybe a persistent weak layer in there, whereas this looks like a little more fresh snow, maybe a storm or wind slab. And then just like avalanches, collapsing and cracking are a clear sign that the snowpack is unstable. And also the nature of that can give us some clues as to where the instability might be, whether it's widespread, as it could show up on this right photo. It's not very wind loaded, so that might expect to see cracking and collapsing in a lot of areas. But on the left, that's showing like a hard wind slab, so it's telling you that instability is maybe on wind loaded slopes. And just heavy snowfall, strong winds blowing snow mean that it's a day to probably eliminate a lot of steeper terrain, if not all of it. And then a little bit more secondary data. If you have time and if you are getting into avalanche terrain, you should definitely put your shovel in the snow and dig down and look at the layers. And if you don't expect that there's layers there because the forecast didn't mention any, you should be looking for some. And if they did mention them, you should be looking for those layers as well as others that you might not expect. And there's a ton of snowpack tests you can do. The one in this fundamentals class that we focus on, because as practitioners and recreationists, it's one that we use the most in our days off, as well as on our days at the job, is the extended column test. And we do this test, we dig and look for layers and check their stability using this test, so we have something to base our decision to ski on. And it's a reliable way to look for instability if the signs aren't as obvious. If we're seeing avalanches and the danger is considerable or high, we should just be avoiding avalanche terrain, and you don't necessarily have to dig. And it's a good time to grab a bite to eat, chat with the group, give everybody a chance to kind of recover and speak their mind. So I mentioned the extended column test is what we're going to talk about in this class and practice in the field, and we recommend that you learn and practice. And the way we interpret it, which I'll come back to, is that if it propagates a fracture, you don't ski the slope. So I'll come back to how we interpret it after I give a quick demo of how the test is performed. And you start by excavating your snow pit, get a nice flat pit wall that is perpendicular to the fall line. And then you isolate a column that's 30 centimeters upslope by 90 centimeters across the slope. And this video clip shows how we do that using an avalanche probe and a thin cord, which I believe you'll get a cord in the field day for this course. So you can do these tests on your own. And you'll also get some time in the field day to practice these tests. And then you place your shovel on one side of the column or the other. Don't put it in the middle, but we want to just apply force to one side of the column to see if any slabs collapse on any weak layers. And we start with a small amount of force by doing 10 taps from our wrist, counting to 10, and then we do 10 moderate taps by lifting our arm up from the elbow and letting it fall onto the shovel. And then we do 10 hard taps by lifting all the way up to our shoulder and letting that harder force hit the shovel 10 times.
Okay.
You see on that 11th or 12th hit, that's up to the shoulder. And then we kind of continue all the way through to 30, a total of 30 hits. That column broke and propagated on the 11th or 12th hit there. And so we're looking for if it propagated, meaning it broke all the way across that 90 centimeter column. If it only broke underneath the shovel, if that layer only collapsed under the shovel, that's considered no propagation. Here's a video showing some different ECTs to give you an idea of what the results can look like. And it's a progression through the season of a particularly weak snowpack. That one didn't break all the way across the column, so it didn't propagate. Similar to this one here, it's only breaking underneath the shovel. And then we start to get a little more snow on top, and this weak layer isn't, that's a good propagation. These are all starting to propagate. They are propagating. So that was just to give you a visual of what propagation looks like versus what it doesn't look like. And so it's when it goes all the way across the column that it propagates. And so what that means on a recreational level is that if you've done your homework, read the advisory, you've poked around in the snowpack looking for weak layers a little bit, you haven't seen recent avalanches, you haven't seen signs of instability, it hasn't snowed for a week, and you decide you're going to ski this steep slope, you dig a snow pit, do an ECT. If it propagates change of plans, go to a lower angle slope. And if it doesn't, you can continue on because you've already kind of had a lot of data to back up that this slope is stable. When you don't have that forecast data or previous red flag data, and all you have is a snow pit, it becomes a little bit harder. And so if there's any uncertainty, we default to safer terrain. Now, a lot of good questions that are probably coming up are, where do we dig snow pits? When? I kind of just discussed when, and that's really, if it's high danger, if it's considerable danger and you're avoiding avalanche terrain, you don't need to dig. But if there's enough for some reason that you want to go ski in a steep slope, it's a good idea to dig a pit and do a quick extended column test or two before doing that. And the important thing is that we do this where in a representative area that is also safe and courteous. Courteous being, we don't want to put a hole in the middle of a ski run where a snowmobiler or a skier is going to ride into it and get hurt. So if you do dig holes where people ski and ride, try to fill them back in nice and smooth. But it's important to be representative, and the safety part is there's been some recent research that shows you don't have to be on a steep slope to dig and get representative results. So you can do these tests on slopes that are less than 30 degrees and get the same results you would get on slopes steeper than 30 degrees, as long as the snowpack structure is the same. So if you can be pretty sure that you're in a similar elevation and aspect as the slope that you want to go ride on, and the wind loading patterns are similar and stuff, you should do these tests on lower angle slopes where the snowpack is representative of the steeper slopes where you want to travel. And there's definitely a lot of experience that goes into getting that right. And so dig pits and then poke around and see if you're where the variability is and how things line up. So many human factors, as we discussed earlier, can lure us into avalanche terrain. They can convince us to go there or distract us from the objective data and push us into avalanche terrain. But one stability test, if you do an ECT and it propagates, it can snap you out at going into avalanche terrain and save your life. So always dig. But don't forget that signs from Mother Nature always override stability test results. If you're getting stable test results, but there was recent avalanche activity that you either saw or that the forecast talked about, or if you're getting stable test results and it just snowed 2 feet, you should probably take that 2 feet of snow as a red flag over any stable test results. And when we're not sure, always default to safer terrain. So after you've gathered the facts by getting the forecast, looking for signs of instability in the field, digging pits, update your plan or make your plan, and make it in a way that keeps you out of harm's way. Use those facts to decide what types of terrain you're going to avoid for the day, whether it's all avalanche terrain, or maybe there's just specific types where the avalanche problems exist. This is a photo from a avalanche fatality. I think it was in 2019 nearby our advisory area. And a group of 4 it's a longer story, but essentially they were touring up through this slope, that later avalanche where you can see the crown. It's a 40-degree slope, sparsely treed, and they hadn't intended to do that for starting off in the morning, but we're trying to avoid some other avalanche terrain off to the right of the photo. And I I show this photo because trees can give us a false sense of security a lot of the time. When really if the slope is steep enough to slide and they're wide enough that you can move, and the trees are wide enough that you can move through them, they create a terrain trap and make a slide more deadly. So just something to consider when assessing terrain, that maybe open slopes are safer if you get something wrong. So kind of to review, how do we make good decisions? First, proper planning, getting the forecast, making a good plan, having multiple plans, being flexible, making sure your number one plan is to return home safe. I like to reiterate, having multiple plans, especially if your first plan is big or requires avalanche terrain, always have some sort of backup, just so you can easily pull the plug. Define your objectives and no-go terrain, kind of create a list of where you want to go, what might be good, and what you're definitely avoiding and where you're not going. And this can really be helpful to do this in a nice, warm, dry environment, where it's a little more unbiased and you're not looking at big objectives. If you don't say we're avoiding that east face of Mount Nemesis before you're looking at it and it looks really attractive, it's going to be even harder to resist. So rule some of that bigger stuff out in the morning where you think you might be tempted later on. Prepare, know who your partners are, have good communication with your partners, and good communication being, be clear with your goals at the beginning of the day, and checking up on each other throughout the day. Let each other know how you're feeling emotionally and physically, and ask each other that kind of stuff. And know where their skill sets are. Going out with new people can sometimes be a little tricky. You can sometimes be surprised by they might not have as much experience as you thought they did, or might have more. So ask a lot of questions in that. Don't be shy to say, have you done this before? Or what have you done? What do you know how to use this gear? Do you have this gear? Being well matched in your desires is really important. And just understanding what each other's goals are for the day. If one person is thinking you're going for a 5,000 vertical foot tour and the other one's thinking you're doing 2,000 feet and just a couple POW laps, there's going to be something not good at some point of the day. So be clear with each other. And also the balance also comes from having the same kind of gear. Like, if you have ice axe and crampons and your partner doesn't, you shouldn't be using them going up a steep slope and sandbagging them because they don't have them. You could leave your stuff in the car if they forgot theirs, and make sure you're going to both be at the same level of performance. And I don't want to discourage folks from like new people going out with more experienced people, but especially if you're the more experienced one, realize that you want to tailor your day towards what's going to work best for them, and you're going to be more capable, so don't get them in over their head. And then if you're the less experienced one, be clear that, hey, I'm not comfortable with this, or that's a little more than I'm capable of. And it can be uncomfortable to speak up, but it'll definitely avoid mistakes and worse situations when you get out there. Having checklists and routines can play into the good decision-making process. And I won't get into specific checklists and routines, but I like to point people towards using these for your more daily kind of mundane tasks. Like I like to have a routine of where I put my pack and unload all my gear at the end of the day, so that in the next day, it's all in the same spot and I'm not running around wasting energy trying to remember where I put my beacon or my pack. And so when I take it out to dry, it all kind of goes into a place, and then there's kind of a system there that's very repeatable and it saves physical energy as well as pretty important mental energy for making decisions later. And so people use checklists like this in the morning to make sure they have all the right gear, and that way you don't have to strain your brain trying to not forget your lunch, and you can save that brain energy when you're at a decision point in the field. And ultimately, we need to practice making decisions. Have those routines, have those checklists that help you practice, continue to use them. Recognize if you get off your routine, that you might be expending a little more energy to get back on it. And on days, even on like mellower days or days where there's not a huge objective, always just have a decision-making routine where you confirm with your partners before you leave the trailhead. How's everyone feeling? Is all our gear in operation? Are we all on the same page of what we're doing? And then having a couple check-ins through the day, and work that into your daily routine, so that it's a more turnkey and less energy to make decisions. Here's a tool that I recommend taking a look at before I wrap it up here, called the Strategic Mindsets. It's a paper by Roger Atkins that was presented at the International Snow Science Workshop in 2014. And these are kind of starting points for your day to figure out maybe where you're going and where your decision-making process might go for the day. Are we going to have to make a lot of decisions through the day? If you're in an assessment mindset, you might be doing that. Or if you're stepping out into bigger terrain, you're going to have to make a lot of decisions. But some of these status quo, or if you're stepping back, it might be like, hey, our decision's made that we're staying at avalanche terrain yet again. Here is the link. If you can type that in or search for that paper there, you can find all the nitty gritty, and I highly recommend checking out that paper. So the strategic mindsets are a kind of a baseline to begin your discussion for the day. And Atkins also mentions in that paper a discussion called the selection of desires. And the idea of this is that we need to adjust our goals to suit the conditions. And if we have specific goals that are big and require travel in avalanche terrain, we have to choose the appropriate conditions or wait for the appropriate conditions to accomplish those goals. And finally, a quote from often said by 40-year legend of Bridger Bowl ski patroller, mountain manager, Randy Elliott: if you can't be good, be lucky. And that always leads me to say, when you get lucky, recognize when you're lucky in order to be better. As I mentioned at the beginning of this, we make bad decisions as humans. We get lucky, but if we deny that we got lucky and say like, oh, I did everything right, we're going to make that same bad decision again. So when you have close calls, and even when you don't have close calls, practice debriefing every day. Say, did we make good decisions, or did we get lucky? And if we got lucky, what can we do better next time? So practice decision making, continue to learn. If you're going to be out, if you're going to have a long time in the mountains, got to keep learning about this stuff and attending seminars and workshops where you'll hear about other people's research and mistakes, and ask a lot of questions. So please write down your questions for the virtual Q&A before the field day, as well as any questions you have for the field day. Those are both going to be really good times for us to discuss this and clear everything up. So thanks a lot for your time, and have a safe winter.